Good evening. Warm welcome to all of you here, and thanks to the Chicago Council on Global Affairs for a very interesting event that we have starting us off today. I just wanted to have a quick reminder as well that our conversation today is on the record, as is the question and answer period, and that the opinions and discussion expressed by our speakers are their views alone and do not reflect any institutional positions. My name is Pia Wanek. I'm the CEO of DT Institute, which is a non-governmental organization, a nonprofit working in the peace and development space, working in conflict, fragile, and closed environments, and we focus on peace building, media and technology, and human rights. And I'm joined on the panel first by Dr. Rebecca J. Wolfe. She's a leading expert in political violence, conflict, and violent extremism, serving as a senior lecturer at the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago. She's also an associate at the Pearson Institute for the Study and Resolution of Global Conflicts. And with a background at Mercy Corps, she combines extensive practitioner and academic experience to conduct research, design evidence-based interventions, and communicate effectively to diverse audiences. Nathaniel Raymond, he's currently the executive director of the Humanitarian Research Lab at the Yale School of Public Health and a lecturer in the epidemiology of microbial disease. He has nearly 25 years of experience as a humanitarian aid worker and a human rights investigator. And he supervises the Humanitarian Research Lab's work with the U.S. State Department's Conflict Observatory related to Ukraine. So I think we all know there's no doubt that we're facing an unbelievable complex time now with conflict and crisis across the globe stemming from active war, hostile governments, proxy actors, decline of democracy and democratic ideals, compounded by and contributing to the negative impact on people and communities from climate change. When confronted by a barrage of disturbing images in real time, it's really a difficult and sobering reality to deal with. But I'm really pleased to see that the interest in the room and those that actually registered for this event to really try to grapple with some of these challenges around being a humanitarian, working in these complex environments, and wanting to better understand humanitarian assistance in the midst of conflict and war. Before we jump into the deeper conversation grappling with impartiality and access and what's the appropriate response, as we're seeing in Israel-Gaza, Ukraine, Sudan, or other seemingly forgotten crises in the world that you don't see as much on the headlines, I'd like to ask our panelists to first set the stage for humanitarian action and the fundamental principles that undergird humanitarian work. Both have extensive on-the-ground experience in the major crises of the modern era and are well-placed to speak to that last mile work of the aid worker, as well as the legal framework that guides us. So first, I'd like to turn to Rebecca. Please start us off with sort of a high-level primer of humanitarian action.
So there's the four main principles: humanity, independence, impartiality, and neutrality. And I won't go into the definitions, but I think what we hope ideally is that humanitarians can actually maintain those throughout intervention. However, actually, a lot of times it's about balance between them. Mm-hmm. So especially in today's conflicts, often a state is one of the actors in that, yet humanitarians actually need permission from states to access those civilians who are in need of aid. And so how to maintain, for example, neutrality when you have to get agreements from a government to go in is particularly hard. This was like in Syria, this was one of the most difficult things why a lot of aid agencies actually left. And so in the government-controlled areas of Syria had less humanitarian aid from many actors because those agencies decided that they could not remain neutral and then actually be impartial given the way the government was directing agencies to deliver aid. And so often these principles, you have to figure out how to balance those trade-offs.
So how does humanitarian response differ from charity, per se?
So the first day of class when I teach about humanitarian response at Yale, the first thing I say is humanitarian aid is not charity. Let's get that clear. And so what does that mean? It is a rules-based, legal and ethical system for the provision of assistance in complex emergencies. That can mean conflict, that can mean natural disaster. And it is because of the principles, going back to what Rebecca laid out for us, is that because of neutrality, because of impartiality, because of independence, and most importantly, the anchor principle, which is humanity, which means the humanitarian imperative comes first. That unlike charity alone, we deliver based on need and nothing else. That is the goal. And so there's really only five verbs that humanitarian actors do. We prepare, we assess, that's how we figure out need. We deliver against that assessment. We evaluate, did it work? And then we advocate, and often we're doing that advocacy part throughout the cycle for the things we don't control. And the things that we need, as Rebecca was saying, about access, about creating humanitarian space. So a large part of that advocacy is negotiating so we can do these other four verbs. And so charity, really, at the end of the day, charity is about this idea that we're giving to a cause. But humanitarianism is a professional practice of individuals who have a code, and that's the Red Cross NGO Code of Conduct. And it is the extension into an ethical framework of the legal grounding provided by international humanitarian law. So when we say international humanitarian law, it is actually the law of armed conflict, okay? And so the space that's created for humanitarians and for non-combatants creates these ethical principles by which we preserve that space, we take that space, and we operate in that space.
So I guess what then happens when we are unable to actually get to a point where all of the principles are able to be actioned? What happens in that kind of circumstance? Perhaps you can speak from one of your experiences on the ground. Perhaps Rebecca first.
Well, in preparing to come here tonight, I'm so excited to be here because this is exactly the type of conversation we need to be having right now at this crucial time, especially with such great folks to the right of me. I was thinking over and over again about a video that was posted by the Rapid Support Forces in the summer from Sudan. And it's this incredible video. It blows my mind. You have Doctors Without Borders workers have been stopped at a checkpoint by Rapid Support Forces, guys with guns. They have guns in the faces of these doctors and health workers, and they are forcing them at gunpoint to do a video to praise RSF for their commitment to humanitarian access. And in that video, like if you're going to teach humanitarian aid work, that's the video. Because think about it, if you've ever had a gun in your face, that's one thing. But now have a gun in your face while having to uphold an ethical code where dying is not the worst thing that could happen. They die, that's not the worst thing that could happen. The worst thing that could happen is they violate the trust with the local population on camera. The worst thing that could happen is they undermine the ability for other aid workers to go in to a non-permissive environment. And so you look at the main guy in that video from MSF, he kept it cool. He never did what RSF wanted him to do, and his team lived. And then afterwards, you see within like 20 minutes, out comes on Twitter, MSF laying out the principles, right? So if you're ever at this moment where like, why does this matter? That's why it matters. Because it was at that moment he used the principles as a tool to negotiate his way through a bunch of guys with guns at a checkpoint to do the job. And that's what a professional aid worker looks like.
Mm-hmm. No, that's excellent. It's a sobering example, but I think a really good one to really bring home how challenging these kinds of environments are.
That's where the rubber meets the road.
So expanding a little further when it comes to access, perhaps, Rebecca, you'd like to speak to some of your experiences as well of how complex it can be to actually gain access as a humanitarian actor in these types of environments.
I mean, I think particularly since really, I mean, it's before Afghanistan, but I think Afghanistan and Iraq have really shifted the way that access and humanitarians can gain access because of the intersection of aid with the army and military giving aid and humanitarians often doing very similar work. And so these lines got blurred. And so humanitarians have become much more of a target in many different environments. And at the same time, governments have transferred more and more risk of delivering aid in these situations that are extremely volatile to aid workers. And then many actors, both state and non-state actors, have been less willing to create that humanitarian space. And so you see this confluence of factors that are really limiting and have reduced the humanitarian space for the last 25 or so years. And so for example, in Syria, where I've spent probably a lot of my work at Mercy Corps, what we found is much more remote management. Mm-hmm. So one of my huge fears is that when there is much more access into Syria, we will actually see that it is even much worse than we ever imagined, because there's been so little access to what is going on there. And so I see this and it's becoming worse and worse over the years in terms of being able to get that aid to people.
So adding another layer of complexity, let's talk a bit about sanctions and sanction environments or sanction groups. How does that add an additional layer and challenge to what a humanitarian organization or humanitarians individually need to be aware of in those kinds of environments?
Yeah, I'm going to go and grab the elephant in the room by the tusks. And, the recent news about UNRWA personnel in Gaza being allegedly affiliated with Hamas. And I want to say up front that in 2018, I worked closely and formally with UNRWA on their data protection policies and have trained with UNRWA personnel, some of whom are dead in the past few months. And so this is personal and really hits home. I want to take that microcosm of the issue around UNRWA and zoom out. Mm-hmm. Anywhere you are delivering aid in a conflict zone, you are having to, 1, deal with non-state actors. Okay. 2, deal with non-state actors, some of whom are very bad actors, some of whom end up being in your local staff. 3rd, you are having to constantly, and I really want to go back to the critical point you raised, Rebecca, about you can't see modern humanitarian aid without looking through the lens of GWAT, the Global War on Terror. Global War on Terror changed everything for us in terms of, back to sanctions, compliance, Office of Foreign Assets Control, Patriot Act, and what constitutes material support for terrorism. Mm-hmm. And so the point is that you are constantly having to, A, access local populations with local people, but B, do so in a way which is compliant to very high, unbelievably high sanction standards, as they should be, but also try doing that on the ground, right? With limited information, limited visibility, while still accessing populations that in many cases, and Rebecca can speak to this better than I can, have with non-state groups, some of whom are terrorist actors, have public service and basically their own aid organizations. And I dealt with this in Sri Lanka with the Tamil Tigers, and where you can't go in and say, I'd like things to be different. You have to deal with how they are. And part of that is this constant struggle to access populations, some of which have allegiances and organizations that you can't make go away.
Rebecca, maybe we can speak to some of your experiences as well. I know you spent a lot of time in the Horn of Africa, maybe broadening out our examples a bit more.
So I think the Horn of Africa, but I would think for this probably northern Nigeria with dealing with Boko Haram. And so that was another where working with the government, but so we had to work in these areas called garrison towns because they wanted to move the populations to those areas so they could clear. But when I was with Mercy Corps, we were giving cash aid. And so being able to see where it went was very difficult. And the government was often accuse not just Mercy Corps, but others of aiding those groups and shutting us down, and then, of course, causing huge suffering amongst those populations that were relying on the aid. And so you saw this challenge of how do you work in these environments. As I said, all this risk is being put onto these NGOs and other humanitarian agencies to deliver aid, and yet the compliance issues, because of the war on terror and our various terrorist watch lists, make it very difficult to deliver aid. I would say Afghanistan, again, think about Afghanistan now. We are trying to find ways of getting humanitarian aid into Afghanistan without officially talking to the Taliban. And that is impossible. Even pre-Taliban, most of the agencies had to have some working relationship with the Taliban in order to deliver aid. And so, but that puts a lot of people at risk, both people who are working in these environments and the actual delivery of aid.
So let's pull that risk element out a little bit as well. In those kinds of environments, when you are either bureaucratic impediments to be able to be actually to deliberate in an effective way, difficult to be able to talk to different groups, an ability to, but an expectation to also deliver impartial, balanced aid. What does that risk, when you take those risks, when you cross those risks, when your donors are criticizing perhaps the risk that you're taking, even though they're being pushed towards you, how does an organization deal with and grapple with that?
You want to take that one? Yeah.
I'll start.
Yeah.
I think this is where, again, you go back to these principles, particularly around humanity, and say the purpose of us being here is keeping people alive. And so how do you then both negotiate with the non-state actors on the ground, but also with your donors and so forth, is how can we create a system in order that we can continue to deliver aid? You're asking us to be here to deliver aid, and so in a way that is neutral and impartial, and to be able to keep people alive. And so let us be able to do that in a way that minimizes the risk to the people on the ground.
Yep. There was, when I was but a young aid worker many years ago in Ethiopia, I was on my first food assessment, basically a food security assessment, to see how many kids in southern Ethiopia, in Oromia in the south, had acute malnutrition. And I saw the local numbers. And so this will give you a sense of how hard it is to do the principles. I saw the local numbers at what was called the Kabele level, which is the village level. Wareda is a county, and then you've got, regions, state level. And as our numbers traveled up from the assessment towards Addis Ababa, the amount of people in Tigray in the north who needed food went up. And our numbers, which were validated on the ground, went down. And so I talked to my boss about this, and I said, they're juking the stats at the central level. They're changing the amount of beneficiaries to basically feed the people who are from the ethnic group that relate to the people in power. And he says, don't worry. We upped our numbers beforehand because we knew they would take them down. So let's unpack that, guys, right? Did we juke the stats, or did we uphold the principle of humanity, right? Okay. So look at that quandary. What was the right thing to do there? You knew the stats were going to go down as they go up, so you hype the stats. So as they decline, you can get closer to maybe what reality is. Is that the principles in action, or is that a violation of the principles, right? Did we violate our objectivity on the assessment, or were we in fact precise, right? Those are in the field, when we get out of being up on stage here and actually do it, those are the types of Aikido moves that are happening to be able to try to get to as best as you can, knowing that often the principles, here's the punchline. The principles are, you're doing them right when they're in conflict, right? You know you're doing them right when they are in conflict with each other.
Yeah,
Please.
I have something to add. I think what we also often forget is we think of these principles as some objective metric, and yet they're in the eye of the beholder. And so you can imagine, so in this example right here, in terms of those integri thinking you did not maintain the principles and the government not thinking you maintain the principles, and yet various colleagues would have said yes by keeping those people alive. When I was working in Sri Lanka, I was often accused of being non-neutral by both sides, which again made me feel like I was probably being neutral, but that's, it's, I think we forget that those perceptions matter in terms of going back to the access questions. How the local population sees you upholding those principles may not be how you think you're actually behaving. And that will, so understanding that local perspective is so important in trying to be able to convey what you're trying to do.
And you're talking about impact there, right? You're talking about what is the actual impact of the programs, the efforts, the initiatives that are there. What are the different ways that aid organizations sort of measure and define what their impact is in these kinds of complex environments?
Why do you have to ask good questions? We are at a moment now where aid work has never been more datafied. Okay, and it's much like the episode in The Wire, if you've seen the HBO show The Wire, about comm stats, the crime stats in the Baltimore Police Department. There's huge pressure on every aid organization to quantify, sometimes with data that doesn't exist, that you can't get, to quantify impact. And so that leads, right now, if you talk to affected populations on the ground, they're over-surveyed, they're over-measured, they're exhausted from quantification coming often before delivery. And so we have a real issue now where we're over, and it's not that monitoring and evaluation isn't important, but in many ways we have focused more on monitoring and evaluation than listening, right? We're taking data in rather than doing what's called CWC, which is how do we communicate with communities? And a large part of that is listening. There was a fascinating study that was done by my colleagues, former colleagues at Harvard Humanitarian Initiative, where they were looking at what organizations, local populations saw as most appropriate in a typhoon response. The number one was the Philippine Army, right? And so the point is that it's not just about measuring impact. It's also listening, back to Rebecca's point.
Right.
How do we know on a cultural contextual level how that community sees impact, how that community sees optimal delivery, how that community trusts or does not trust certain actors. And that's often really hard for organizations that are trying to justify to donors, keep funding us, right? And because sometimes the answers from that listening are not what the orgs want to hear because it's not what the donors want to hear. But that's principles. Again, ding, 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 hashtag the principles matter is, well, the principles tell you have to do that. You have to listen, even if the answer isn't you.
Yeah, so I will say I am probably part of the problem in terms of some of the over data.
Oh, I'm part of the problem.
So I am someone who does randomized control trials, even in humanitarian interventions, and I can talk more in the Q&A of how to manage some of that. I do think we are over surveying populations. One of my more frustrating moments doing humanitarian work was trying to do work in Syria, where we had to prove we were getting to the most vulnerable populations. And the amount of time we spent both arguing with the donor about this, doing the vulnerability assessment, so not so much about impact, but at the broader conversation about monitoring and evaluation, in a population where we're probably just getting people on the margins different. In those areas, in the opposition areas of Syria, everyone was vulnerable. And so the amount of money we were spending in trying to show that we were actually reaching the most vulnerable in this, I was like, if we spent that money actually delivering versus spending all this time on assessments, we would have been more effective. And so I do think we are probably spending our monitoring money and evaluation money potentially on the wrong things.
Fair.
Yeah.
Fair.
And this is a whole other long.
It is. And I want to bring us in as well, turning our attention, I think, to current affairs once again, and sort of the topic for the day, and reflecting on impartiality and the challenges within that. Look at the crisis that's happening in the Middle East today. Are we at is this crisis, does this mark a turning point for the humanitarian community in terms of the way aid needs to be delivered or can't be delivered in these kind of circumstances that are so constrained as they are?
On the plane here, I was thinking about this very question. I think about this question all the time. And one thing that to communicate, the humanitarian community is always hitting pivot points, right? And so we can go back to 2005 was a pivot point with tsunami, with Pakistan floods, with the development of the modern, what's called the cluster coordination system, 2016 World Humanitarian Summit. We can look at it in terms of bureaucratic events. We can look at it in terms of operational events. In terms 2015 Syria migration crisis, pivot point. We're always pivoting, and so but I think if the world learns a lesson on what is happening in Gaza right now, is that there's two conjoined lessons. One is that, I'm stealing Rebecca's point here, but she'll amplify this. Access matters. Access matters, and the principles matter to ensure access, to ensure space, and here's the second point, the conjoined point. There are limits to what humanitarians can do. And you look at Gaza right now, and I'm talking to my colleagues from multiple organizations that are operational in Gaza, and we call it the clash problem. Should I stay or should I go? Dun, 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 dun. Which is, where do you set the line where you are sending, and I'm just going to speak bluntly, you're sending your personnel into a wood chipper, and you are incurring more dead bodies on the ground from your own personnel than you're actually going to deliver in terms of impact, and you have to make the call, right? And so that's why space matters, because we can't change that operational envelope. We can change how we operate in the envelope, but sometimes, guys, there ain't an envelope, right? And that comes to that moment when you've got to say, we can't go in. The balance of consequences is too high. It's a suicide mission. And so the point is that it shows the importance of humanitarianism. It shows the limits of humanitarianism and the role that states centrally play in seeing humanitarianism as part of a rule-based order. If we're not going to have a rule-based order, we don't have humanitarianism. But if we're going to do that, then that means we have to have states create that space.
Rebecca,
you want to add a point to that one? Heavy topic.
That was an optimistic answer.
I'm trying.
I guess I'm not as optimistic. I was hopeful with the migration crisis, Syria, the World Humanitarian Summit in 2016, that we actually, I'm sorry?
High hopes.
Would be this pivot point. I have, and when I teach.
Humanitarian Woodstock.
We, in my humanitarian class, I do show these pivots and points. And the first time I taught it, I had Syria as another pivot point. And I don't see it anymore. And I worry that because, and this is another whole session we could do around the Security Council and the UN and that inability to end conflicts today. Our humanitarian crises just go on so long that we have had to shift what there's been a push to shift what humanitarians do, but I do agree with Nathaniel. Humanitarians can't do it all, and yet they've been asked to do more since 2015, really. And so until we actually think about the system to actually end these crises, so that they're not, Syria is, almost 15 years now. Yeah. This is, Ukraine, we thought would be short. We're into our third year. It was amazing that Tigray ended as quickly as it did. And yet, it's been a repeated crisis for many years, and they're still having problems getting aid there. And so that's the big shift that needs to happen. And in New York at the UN General Assembly, at the World Humanitarian Summit, there was a World Refugee Forum. We have these high ideals about how we're going to shift aid, and yet because of the operational principles on the ground, we actually can't do it. No. And so I feel there's a mismatch.
Absolutely. Well, and you have a lot of background as well in conflict mediation in the peace and development space. What would you pull from, peace and development actors that are accustomed very much to working in these protracted types of crises, which we all know humanitarian crises are also very much protracted. There's no short and quick responses in any circumstances anymore. What should we be bringing from that conflict mitigation world into this discussion?
So when I started as the director for the Peace and Conflict Unit at Mercy Corps, this was in 2014, and I realized that our peace and conflict work was completely separated from our humanitarian work. And yet, most of the humanitarian work at that point was in conflict-related situations. And so I actually worked on a strategy around it. I'm now more pessimistic about that integration, or what you'll hear talking about the nexus of bringing peace, development, and humanitarian work together. What I do think, and this is again the big outcome of the World Humanitarian Summit, was about ending conflict. Like, if we really want to end humanitarian suffering, we really had to end conflict. And so that's where I talked a bit about the UN piece earlier. I do think there are some conflicts that we could mitigate with our kind of basic peace building tools. So, but these are really intercommunal conflicts where elites are able to mobilize these grievances to escalate conflict. So most of my work is in northern Nigeria, and we've actually seen pretty good evidence of being able to mediate local disputes, and elites aren't able to mobilize those ethnic differences to escalate things. And I think work like that would be, for example, really helpful in South Sudan at this point. But that's not going to end conflicts between Ukraine and Russia, where there isn't that intercommunal dimension. I actually think the US government wastes a lot of money on those type of programs between Israel and Palestine, because you actually can't have that contact. And this is an elite problem. This is not a intercommunal problem. And so we do need to think through where there are the elite issues and how we address those. And then where are intercommunal issues able to actually expand and escalate conflict.
Do you think these conversations are being had right now? Do you think this juxtaposition of the different areas, do you think we're having the right conversations?
No comment. These conversations are happening. That for me is not the question. They are happening. The problem is where is the deliberative body to turn them into action? That's the problem, not the conversations. You want to see these conversations? I can show you where these, And so it goes back to Rebecca's point here. The UN Security Council right now is not functioning the way it was 5 years ago, the way it was 10 years ago, et cetera. And even then, it wasn't so hot to begin with. And then now I'll be the depressing one. We have to add another issue on here, especially when we're talking about intercommunal violence, is climate change. And we can see the roots of, look, as someone who's worked a long time on South Sudan and on the Horn, just like you, I mean, what makes the difference in terms of peace versus conflict is the grass growing and is the water up in the rainy season, right? That's what prevents, in pastoralist communities, war. But when the forage goes down and the water holes are low, violence goes up. Mm-hmm. The forage is going down and the water holes are low, okay? Particularly in West Africa. And so we now we can't be humanitarians in the 21st century without also being part of the issues around climate change. And here's the problem, is that this is not what we're equipped to do. If we look back in history, say you were a young aid worker in the 1980s, you would be trained primarily as a nutritionist or a logistician. Now, the aid workers that we're training in our classrooms, the aid workers of tomorrow, are going to have to be data scientists. They are going to have to be climate specialists, and they are going to have to also be experts in not just civil military relations, but corporate humanitarian relations, because we're increasingly reliant on corporations for data, for critical parts of how we deliver. And so you see, as time goes on, the skill sets are changing, the environment ambiently, but the literal environment is changing in ways which are affecting the underlying mechanisms by how crisis occurs. And this is the last thing I want to say, is that if I had a whiteboard, I would write vulnerability, okay, times, basically, and I'm going to get this probably wrong, a disaster is a simple equation, which is vulnerability times impact, okay? And what I mean by that is disasters don't exist naturally, okay? They are the combination, this algorithm of pre-existing vulnerability plus the shock impact equals a disaster, right? The V is going up globally, and the I, in terms of shock impacts, is going up. What's going to happen? The D is going up. The money's going down, the space is contracting, and here we are. Now I'm depressed.
Rebecca, any final comments before we turn to our Q&A?
I mean, I think on that, because where we started here was really on the conflict aspect. This is where that access issue gets even more. So what we saw, for example, on the Horn of Africa, we had a famine that covered the whole Horn. Those who suffered most were in Somalia because of those access issues. And so that's where we're going to see how the climate and conflict, that intersection, makes people that much vulnerable compared to, I mean, it's what the climate issues where their government is mostly functioning is going to be hard, but that vulnerability is not so intense that they'll be able to recover. It's, I think, where we're going to see, and then this extension of humanitarian crises are in these places that are already so vulnerable.
Thank you so much for the primer on humanitarian action, on the principles, and even some reflections on some pretty heavy circumstances that we're grappling with as a broader community. I see we have a number of different questions, and I open it up to our first. Please.
Hi, thank you so much. I work in the human rights space, but I feel like I just got a master class, so I appreciate that. My question is, I am not the individual on the ground. Those are my colleagues. I am in that donor development advocacy awareness space. So this might sound like a flippant question, but it's really not. I've really never heard that over-surveyed, over-measured, although even this morning I had a briefing with our VP of Global Monitoring and Evaluation, really to learn a little bit more about what we do. Is there studies? Is there research that we frankly can share with our volunteers, with our donors here in the States?
I don't know if there's actually like a study that would say that. I think
We need to do that stuff.
but I do think, like, I remember being in a meeting on migrants and refugees, and UNHCR was in the meeting as well as some researchers, and they were both surveying the same people on the same issues. And I remember the UNHCR representative was like, why don't we just share data? Do you know how hard it is to get UN data? And then you have these, and is it the exact same questions? And so people often don't think through those issues, where we could work together. I think the other piece, and this is, I think a lot of humanitarian agencies think of data as too cheap, because we often don't pay participants in those studies. Actually, researchers are more likely to pay participants than humanitarian actors. And so I actually think if data was more expensive, we would be more thoughtful in how we used it, and we would be more respectful to the people who we're asking their time of.
Please.
Hi, thank you. I'll make it short and sweet. How have private military contractors complicated your guys' jobs?
Ooh, I feel like Nathaniel will want that one.
So I've worked in a variety of environments where you see PMCs, private military contractors, in a variety of ways all at once. And in South Sudan, I had a moment where a unnamed private military contractor was providing security to aid organizations, was providing security to an oil company, and providing security to governments, right? And so we've talked a lot about how humanitarians use the principles. If you take away one thing from that, it's about distinction, okay? And so this will answer the question on PMCs. Distinction is at the core of what we do as humanitarians, to distinguish ourselves from other actors, okay? And we do that through literal physical things. The French in the early days of the Geneva Convention call it emblemage, the use of aprons with the Red Cross on it and putting a Red Cross or Red Crest on the side of a vehicle. That is distinction, that we are hors de combat. We are removed from fighting. But with the evolution of PMCs, private military contractors, and other quasi-governmental armed groups, and groups who are involved in kinetic operations, maybe without a gun, that distinction becomes harder and harder. And so one of the most critical things we have to do when we enter a space, and this was the case in Iraq, so Iraq is a case study in this, there wasn't a civil society that pre-existed because of the Ba'ath and Hussein. And so when Oxfam and other organizations were going in, we were going in with no pre-existing distinction that existed in Afghanistan. That's the real challenge right now. And some PMCs are exploiting that distinction problem.
Oh, excellent question.
Well, and I think the distinction has also made it harder because aid workers have become targets. And so a lot of organizations have gone to a low profile security method to actually blend in rather than actually using signage to show that they are aid workers.
Fair. We have quite a few questions as well. Thanks so much for keeping them short and sweet like the last.
Of course, yeah. I hope this isn't going down the weeds too much, but I work for a nonprofit that primarily does clean water work, filter distribution, and well digging, both in response to conflict and natural disasters, but also larger long-term community-based projects. One thing that I've noticed as I've gotten familiar with our operations is that our individual donors really love to respond to disaster response gifts. They're moved with their hearts, less data-driven. They like a good picture, they'll give. Our corporate clients love data, very averse to especially conflict response fundraising. So in terms of your experience, and you've mentioned kind of how systems aren't working that would offer larger funding pools and those processes. So where do you see the role of individual funders and crowdfunding in kind of stopgap and some of these smaller, more quick response conflict humanitarian?
I feel like that's a class in and of itself too.
Yeah.
Answer on that one.
Well, I want to say up front, water, sanitation, hygiene is the most important thing that humanitarians do. It is cholera and acute watery diarrhea, waterborne diseases that kill as many, if not more people than bombs and bullets. And you have to understand the big killer in war, it's cholera and similar types of microbial disease. So this work is essential. Now to get to your question, I think we're at a point now where the funding environment is changing rapidly. When I say donor, government money is going down as need goes up. And so we're increasingly trying to answer your question.
Right.
And we don't have common standards for how do we do large-scale individual donorship, because in many ways we never really had to as a system.
Yeah.
Please.
How are you guys able to maintain impartiality and kind of neutrality in humanitarian efforts, especially in times of crisis where there's two sides and it's hard?
That's you.
I mean, I don't think we always can. And I do think, as I said, in some of my earlier remarks, in Syria, this was really difficult. And I remember, being part of those conversations, deciding to leave Damascus. And that did mean there were people in Syria, in the government-controlled areas, that would not get aid. I do wonder if other aid agencies did stay. If all had pulled out, I think that in some ways would have been a harder conversation. So this was also an issue in the refugee camps in DRC from Rwanda, where some left and some didn't. And I think the conversation, always thinking that there's someone else who's going to deliver, who might not feel the same pressures, kind of almost hides the moral quandary people are under. I think I can see with various governments that's going to, as long as you need that access, it just becomes much more difficult to remain completely neutral, because you have to get that entrance. The other thing that actually, which we didn't talk about, is where you're getting your money from. And so if you're getting government money from a bilateral donor, you are implementing their foreign policy. And so whether there's the neutrality on the ground, but there's also the neutrality of who the government who's funding you, what they want to achieve with the humanitarian aims. And often that is not neutral or particularly impartial. Or they, under the Trump administration, there was the second aid administrator was very conscious of protecting Christians. And this made it very difficult to be impartial in, say, Iraq post-ISIS. So there was an emphasis on protecting Yazidis and not Sunnis. And so, but if you're getting US government money, then you don't have that much, you have to actually play by those rules. MSF is doesn't take money from those donors in order to maintain the principles.
Thanks, and this has been great. So I was wondering how donors should react to allegations of non-neutrality or non-impartiality. I'm specifically thinking of UNRWA. Obviously, serious allegations were made. Recent reports in the Wall Street Journal, I think maybe U.S. intelligence is casting doubts on those, on some of those allegations, but not after funding has been withdrawn. So is it innocent until proven guilty, guilty until proven innocent? How should we respond to allegations, serious allegations, after they're made?
Great question. And in your question, you had your own answer, which is the shoot first and ask questions later approach, especially when you're dealing with an environment like Gaza, where there's only 3 to 4 organizations left.
Right.
And so in UNRWA, no one can deliver like UNRWA. That's not a political statement, that's a statement of math. And so the point is that here's the answer to the question. You cannot politicize survival level assistance. And so you must be responsible for investigating those claims and having and being accountable if you failed. I've been a whistleblower in an aid organization, and it's really important that we are held to a very, very high standard, not just on this, but on issues of sexual exploitation, et cetera. And those things are non-negotiable. But what is also not negotiable is that someone has to deliver that assistance. And so it's about making sure that there is, from the political demand, that governments don't react like a weather vane to these allegations before we have facts on the table. Then people need to be held to account, but don't shoot first and ask questions later.
Excellent. Please.
What about situations that are slightly below conflict level, humanitarian situations like you have in Panama, where you have a lot of people that are fleeing, that are going through the Darien Gap rainforest?
I can do a quick response to this, which is international humanitarian assistance exists for when governments do not have the capacity to respond. And in the United States, I saw the one moment, I was in Katrina, which was a transformative event for me, the one moment where UN OCHA, the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, called the United States and said, hey, buddy, need some help? And the US said no. But the point is this, is that back to what I was saying before about climate change, we're at a moment now where we have this system. L1 is a national disaster. L2 is a regional. L3 is a global. With climate change, because the L1s are going up, it means that our L3 global response capacity is declining. So you're going to see more and more states you wouldn't expect, Australia, wildfires, for example, needing mutual support assistance, which is going to affect the entire ecosystem for places where international humanitarian agencies are the only game in town.
Rebecca, would you like to take one? Okay.
Great. So you guys have discussed kind of how hard it is to deliver aid in regions where tension's like extremely high. For example, in Gaza, it can almost be kind of a suicide mission just because of the status of the war. How can you improve, I guess, like tension and communication in order to be able to kind of establish a place where you can go in and give that aid without being an extreme risk for the humanitarian workers?
Rebecca, that sounds up your
Yeah, I'll at least start. I mean, I think what's happened is what has become what we call remote management. And so a lot of, for example, in Syria, most of the operations were not in, for the opposition areas in Syria, most of the aid was coming in through Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan. And so you had the agencies based there working with locals on the ground. So you had, in a sense, civil society actors in Syria being the ones to actually be able to deliver the aid. And so that was the kind of mode of operandi there. And so the challenge, though, again, there is you're putting risk on local populations to deliver that aid. And so I have discomfort with that. But that was the only way to do it. And when we were talking about those pivot points, that was kind of the pivot point in Syria, was how do you deliver aid when you can't have people on the ground? What I think Gaza is becoming even more extreme in that sense, because there's not that, there we had the aid agencies there, and now they've had to, most of them have pulled out. And even the UN agencies that are there, they can't operate. So if people saw the news, the aid that has come in, just people are so desperate, they're not able to deliver it securely. And so you have these, and so I'm not sure what's going to happen in this case. And I'll say it's probably going to get worse because of the concern on the Rafah border and Egypt not wanting people come to the other side. And so that's going to close space again. I'm not sure if you have anything to add.
No, you nailed it.
Comprehensive.
With the large number of crises that exist in the world today, how do humanitarian organizations determine where to allocate their resources to?
Ooh, prioritization.
This is such a crucial question.
Yes.
And and for me, so what I do and what we do at the Yale Humanitarian Research Lab is really, a lot of it is about assessment. And a couple of years ago, we did the evaluation of the Joint Intersectoral Analysis Framework, which is basically the way by which the UN humanitarian system evaluates need. And so the word triage is crucial here, which is we have to develop systems we can trust, and this comes back to data. And now I'm going to sound like the exact opposite of everything I was saying before. Oh, wow. Is that data is now increasingly crucial to make those triage decisions consistent with the principles. And if we don't have good assessment systems, then we're violating the principles from day one, right? And so now the building ways of seeing, especially in non-permissive environments, so we're using remote sensing, satellites, we're using call detail records, flow monitoring of population movements to try to do this triage remotely. It is not perfect, but it's what we're left with. So that's part of how we live the principles now, is how accurate our assessments are.
So I'm going to take the question in a slightly different way. I think what we've also seen, as I said, crises don't seem to end, yet more get added to the pool of crises we're responding to. And so most of the requests go underfunded. And so, for example, Ukraine got significant funding when it first started. That, of course, is decreasing. And Yemen has barely been funded for what its need from the start in 2014. And so a lot of these decisions, unfortunately, are political decisions, not actually by need. And so, and I think one of my big fears is there's that issue, but then when I've actually seen places make progress, when a humanitarian disaster then strikes somewhere else, all the funding gets moved to that new one, so you can't actually solidify the gains on the ground. So in Iraq, pre-ISIS, the humanitarian aid for a while, it started to move into recovery and development aid, and things were actually moving, and then ISIS hit, and all the funding shifted from that work to the humanitarian aid, and so all those gains were lost. I saw that in Nigeria multiple times now, and so that's, unfortunately, it becomes both. I think it's a political decision and then acute need decision, and so that's kind of the calculation.
Thank you.
Excellent. I think that's a good overview. And last question as we wrap up.
Hi, thanks. Could you go a little bit more into what you meant by elite problems versus, I think you said intercommunal, and how that relates to those, to the ones you mentioned? Yeah.
Sorry. So I think we can think of conflicts happening at multiple levels. And so a lot of my work, Nathaniel talked about like farmers and pastoralists, and they are often divided by ethnic and religious group identities. You see this, think about the Balkans between, like in Kosovo, between the Kosovar Albanians and the Kosovar Serbs. And so you had people, though, living together. And so there were grievances. I also say, people talk about ancient hatreds. There's also ancient getting along. And so those conflicts can escalate. So, for example, in Sri Lanka, you would have like an interpersonal dispute, but people were from different backgrounds. Rumors would escalate. Then rumors about what happened would get to both sides. Someone would do something stupid, and then it could quickly escalate into pretty extreme violence. That can stay at an intercommunal level and not spread. However, when governments are on those same type of intercommunal divides, they can actually mobilize those grievances for more. So that's what we saw in the Balkans very significantly. That's what we saw in Sri Lanka. That's what we saw or continuing to see in South Sudan. I also think there are conflicts that are really like an interstate conflict, like Ukraine and Russia is really about elites. Yes, there are some Ukrainians and Russians living in the same areas in those countries, but this is, in order for us to get peace there, it's really dealing at the elite level. Again, with Israel-Palestine, because of the segregation between those communities, yes, they'll be at some point dealing with Israeli Palestinians and Israelis, Jews in that area. You're within the borders of Israel. There are other issues to take place, but between the occupied territories in Israel, that is an elite problem that needs to get solved. And you're not going to be able to do it with intercommunal peace building.
I feel like we've done the full round robin when it comes to humanitarian principles, the issues of our times. I would like to ask all to thank our colleagues for an exceptional panel. I feel like we've learned a lot. Thank you very much.